These two are the current heavyweight favorites of the SFF world. So today let's throw them into the ring and see if either one manages to land a knockout punch. Now, just to temper your expectations though, no YouTubers were harmed in the making of this video, but I also won't be charging you 50 bucks either to watch this bout. Welcome to Machines and More. As you might have noticed, this studio is getting a little bit of a makeover. So thank you for your patience while I'm changing things around and reconfiguring things, and I will have a new round of studio updates for you guys soon. But today let's talk NR200P versus Meshlicious, and I think that's a comparison that many of you have made, or a decision that many of you are in the process of making. If you're agonizing between either of these two cases, I totally understand, because these are both fantastic SFF cases, each within their own right, and they all have some special abilities. So to help you make that choice, I'll break it down objectively today, and let's see which one comes out on top. And this will also wrap up the Meshlicious series that I've been working through for the last couple months, and it won't be necessarily the last video I do on this case, but at this point I have tried many different builds and configurations in this case, and I do feel comfortable to make a long-term review rating and recommendation for the case. So these you see here, these are the custom loop versions with some mods here and there, but we will be comparing the case mostly in their official out-of-the-box capabilities. I'm going to be giving numerical ratings here that I think are pertinent to the general SFF community. Obviously there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I am trying to be as objective as possible here. If you do have a set of different priorities, please take note of the comparative strengths and then evaluate accordingly. Alright, to lead things off, let's talk about size. The Meshlicious comes in at 14.7 liters, while the NR200P comes in at the 18, so there's no question that the Meshlicious is in fact smaller, but more importantly is the efficiency within that volume and also the footprint. Now, the vertical tower orientation of the Meshlicious is innovative and it's unique, and it also occupies a very small footprint. If you're tight on desk space, that 245 by 165 millimeter footprint of the Meshlicious will be very palatable to you. So for that, the Meshlicious scores a 9 out of 10. Both cases are very good in how they utilize the available space within their volumes, but the NR200P features a horizontal, more traditional layout, and that is simply larger, and so for that it gets a 7 out of 10. Next up is the build experience and cable management. For first-time builders or occasional builders, this can be a very significant category. Both, I would say, are very, very easy cases. In fact, I'd call both best in SFF for ease of build right now, since all the panels can easily come apart. And in fact, most of those panels can come apart without the use of any tools. However, the NR200P leads the way in terms of cable management. It's simply easier to conceal cables in the case, and there's more logical mounting points for those cables. And with the front panel also serving as a place to tuck away unsightly cables, this one scores a 10 out of 10 in this category, whereas I'd score the Meshlicious a notch lower at 9 out of 10, simply because this cable management is not great. 20mm motherboard standoffs can be helpful, but that will also push out the motherboard, and it will limit your cooling options. One thing you might be concerned about is how well either of these cases are made, and that's where these two cases are in fact pretty similar. Both are of the more mass-produced steel case variety. There's really nothing exotic here in terms of materials like aluminum, but they are both well made. Panels are of similar quality and finish. The paint on the NR200 is a little more consistent overall, but I've also seen some misaligned panels as well. So both of these score a 7 out of 10 in this category. So now let's move on to component compatibility. Both of these cases can support an ATX power supply, but out of the box only. The Meshlicious is directly compatible. With the NR200P, you do need to purchase or 3D print your own ATX power supply bracket. The NR200P does support DTX boards officially, but when properly configured with the right power supply, the Meshlicious can also do that. GPU support where it matters is essentially the same. The Meshlicious can support up to a 4-slot card if that matters to you. Both cases feature at least a PCIe 3.0 riser cable, and with the NR200P the use of that is completely optional and reserved for the vertical GPU orientation, and it is mandatory though for the Meshlicious. And the ease of use of this riser cable does depend somewhat on your CPU choice and your motherboard's PCIe support, but I think many users will actually want to get the 4.0 version. Overall, the cases do maintain parity in this realm, but I do think the bigger difference is in drive support, where the NR200P has a few mounting options for 3.5-inch drives, whereas the Meshlicious can only do so with a small GPU oriented in a horizontal position. More importantly is the ease with which the NR200P supports multiple 2.5-inch SSDs, most logically behind that front panel, but it also has mounting points inside the case as well. Whereas the Meshlicious does make drive support a little bit more difficult with cabling and placement due to mounting under and around components near the bottom of the case, and that is competing for space with other items. With that, I'm giving the NR200P 9 out of 10, and the Meshlicious does lose a couple points here because of the storage options. Cooling support is a very important attribute to consider, and I do break that out here between air, liquid, and fan support. Liquid cooling support is about equal in both cases. Now, both cases support up to a 280 radiator in theory, which is as big as one could typically hope for in SFF, but that's only part of the story, and this is where things get interesting for the NR200P, because if you want to run that glass panel that puts the P in NR200P, you do have to vertically mount the GPU, and that does reduce the cooling support to a suboptimal bottom-mounted 240, although you really do still have that side mount option if you forego the glass panel. Now, by contrast, the Meshlicious does have one mounting location, but it's an absolutely great one, and you can position the rad and the pump positions pretty optimally for an AIO. Now, there's one problem here, though, and that is the rad plus the fan thickness is limited by the thickness of the case divider, but for most of you that will be building with the more popular AIOs, that roughly 60 millimeter thickness total that you can play around with isn't as huge a limitation as the NR200P's suboptimal mounting location. So for that, I'd give 7 for the NR200P and 9 for the Meshlicious. Air cooling support, the Meshlicious by design is going to fall behind here. That clearance is limiting, but it is slightly better than some sandwich style cases, and although outside official measurements, a Big Shuriken 3 or ID Cooling IS60 Evo will fit even with an upgraded 25mm fan from my experience. Still though, not even small towers are supported in this height segment, and one thing to note is that you typically will want to go with the 2 mesh panel version for optimal performance. And although not perfect, the NR200P does have much better support for air coolers, and again, you do have more options with the vented panel that is included, but if you want to use the glass, then for airflow reasons, you are much better off with a tower cooler. The Scythe Fuma 2 and the Mugen 5 do fit well, although in my experience, the slightly lower Scythe Mugen 5 does seem to fit a little bit more reliably across a variety of motherboards. Something like the reference grade Noctua NHU12A may or may not fit depending on your tolerances and what motherboard you're using, and even Cooler Master's own MA612 Stealth can be made to fit marginally with the cover removed and occasionally with screws that are required to hold down the glass panel securely. With the mesh panel though, you do open up a world of spectacular air-cooled builds like the Noctua C14S type of top-down air cooling build, and unofficially even a semi-passive NHP1 build like I tested is possible. Officially it's not D15 compatible like the Sliger S620 is out of the box, but I do know that many of you have been busy modding the case away in different ways to take that big dual tower. But for SFF, this type of cooler support already lands it in what I'd call the upper echelon, and I'll give it an 8 out of 10 here, while the Meshi gets a passing grade of 5 points. Fan support is also a very important consideration because airflow is important to performance, and while you might not need all of the NR200P's 5 fan mounting points while using the glass panel, they're there, and well, let's just say for optimal performance with that glass panel and warmer GPUs, at least having the bottom and top fans are very helpful. With a mesh panel, you do gain the ability to have either the radiator on the side or place case fans there as well, and to put it quite simply, this type of fan support is unparalleled and it is best in class, so the full 10 out of 10 here for the NR200P. If the Meshlicious had an Achilles heel, this might be it. Due to the design, you get 2 fan mounting points and that's it. If you have a radiator mounted there, well, no more fans for you. So 5 points for the Meshlicious considering that. Now, of course, the airflow is simple in this case and effective when you exhaust air out the front, but the fact remains you can't add fans to assist the graphics card or assist an air cooler if you're running one, and that leads us into the category of performance and thermals. For this high-level comparison, I'll omit the graph since I've had a few other videos on this thermal comparison between these two cases, but in terms of CPU performance when optimally configured, the Meshlicious with an AIO is good, but it does see a bit of interference from a graphics card, especially when you have a radiator mounted at the front exhausting, which the more straightforward airflow layout does make up a little bit for. For the NR200P, you can get great CPU performance with both air and liquid cooling, and with fans set up the right way, it can be slightly, but not necessarily meaningfully better than the Meshi. For the graphics card, the NR200P's bottom fans do really help out hotter cards. Now, of course, your ability to run these does depend on how you set up the case and how thick your card is, but it is a very powerful option when combined with two top fans, and this is equally good for the more conventional type of side exhausting GPUs and also flow-through cards that are more popular right now. And in my opinion, this case is best in SFF for graphics card performance across a variety of cards. With negative pressure or front exhaust, cards can also run very well in the Meshlicious, but it does depend on the card and how much space you have and how you can configure that card. Cards that vent out the sides do work very well with this case, but flow-through coolers need some special attention, and they do work much better with space between the divider and the card, so if you can space it out to that 4-slot or a 3-slot for a 2-slot card, that would be better. Still though, this is very much dependent on the card you plan to run and the amount of space that you can give to the card, because your motherboard's also a factor there. And that is where the more flexible layout of this sandwich divider does come in pretty handy. When considering both CPU and GPU cooling, the NR200P does edge out the Meshlicious, 17 points to 15. And lastly, here's the category where I think the Meshlicious absolutely excels, and that is the appearance and the layout of the components. You can display either side, which is great for placement on a desk. It's an innovative and stunning looking case, especially for a custom loop. And although cable management is a bit challenging in the case, with some extra TLC and creativity, you can absolutely make it look great. And as much as I like the standard horizontal layout of the NR200P, it is quite typical in that regard. Now, the way it placed the power supply was actually quite forward thinking when it first came out, but I think overall the case is just more vanilla in that sense, more normal. Certainly components can still display very nicely in the case, but I think the Meshlicious wins full points here. So let's tally it up. As a whole, I think the areas that the NR200P scores really well in are cooling support and performance, whereas the SUPD does exceptionally well with its form, its layout, and its looks. With that, the NR200P does come out on top as the better case as a whole, and it scores 83 points versus the 76 from the Meshlicious. And again, I'll footnote that this does depend on how you weight each category. I don't use price as a rating because it's not a factor that I think affects the quality of the case directly, and it more so influences your purchasing decision. Not to mention that market prices can and have changed. For example, the NR200P was $10 less when it was first introduced compared to it is now. That being said, these two cases are currently neck and neck with the base configuration of the Meshlicious in the PCIe 3.0 version with one glass panel, coming in at exactly the same price pretty much as the NR200P currently, which is $110 US. However, one thing to keep in mind is that the PCIe 4.0 version of the Meshlicious is advisable if you have a PCIe 4.0 CPU, GPU, and board, and since that cable is absolutely mandatory, this is a pretty important consideration. And PCIe 4.0 risers being what they are at this point in its product life cycle, they are still quite expensive, and that does bring up the case to $180. Still though, the GPU end of the case is a bit of a pain in the rear I/O. So if you are running a multiple display setup and you need a right angle display port cable or another or longer right angle HDMI cable, those are an additional cost, while your regular display cables will work just fine with the NR200P. In addition, the NR200P does come with two 120mm fans, so you're ready to go, and it also includes pretty thoughtful fan grills and toolless fan mounting hardware. The Meshlicious is far from a one-trick pony, but it does really tend to favor liquid-cooled gaming builds. And until we can get an accessory side panel as an aftermarket purchase, you're pretty much locked into whichever configuration you have at the beginning. So you do need to be pretty conscious about how you're building the case. If you do have a compatible AIO already, or you plan on running one, if you can get the optimal GPU to fit, or you plan on doing a custom loop, then man, it is such a great case to display and would be my first choice from a looks and footprint perspective. But while it might win by split decision, the NR200P does more things and gives you an almost dizzying number of options in how you configure your case. And I really think it will appeal to a broader segment, especially those that like to change things up or whose builds are evolving as time goes on, such as starting out from a stock cooler and then moving on to a bigger air cooler, or you want to try an AIO or custom loop. That's all fine. And for that reason, it is my favorite SFF test case for the channel because it's simply super versatile. It's a case that is great for someone with a 5950X and a 3090, and it's also equally great for someone with a 3600 and hanging on with a 1070. And you can vertical mount the GPU, you can mount a tower cooler, you can ditch the glass panel altogether if you don't like it. It's just a case that can scale with your needs and adapt to those needs, whether it be workstation or casual gaming or somewhere in between. So there you have it. Perhaps the best solution is one of each, please, but I think we have to be reasonable, right? So it is a great time for SFF, and hopefully this has made your decision that little bit easier. So there's a lot more content to come. I am keen to check out the new NR200P Max and also the new color options, so make sure you are subscribed and hit that bell for notifications. Any questions? Let me know in the comments down below. Give a like, links in the description. Thanks for watching.